I have been covering NATO, Iran, and the geopolitics of the Middle East for over 2 decades. I was in Brussels when the alliance debated Article 5 after September 11th. I was following the back channels in 2015 when the Iran nuclear deal came together thread by thread. I have watched this alliance strain, stretch, and survive things that should have broken it. So when I tell you that what happened on February 28, 2026 is genuinely unlike anything I have seen in my career, I need you to understand what that means coming from me. The United States launched military strikes on Iran, and NATO found out on the news. Not in a briefing, not in a secure call, not in a quietly worded 30 minutes before the bombs fell, on the news, the same way you did, the same way I did, a 75-year alliance built on the foundational principle that no member acts alone in a major military operation, and the most powerful member in that alliance just lit the Middle East on fire and didn't bother to dial. That is not a diplomatic incident, that is a structural rupture, and to understand why it matters so much, you need to understand what NATO actually is at its core, not the tanks, not the Article 5 guarantee, not the defense spending commitments that have dominated headlines for years. What NATO has always been, at its most essential level, is a consultation mechanism. It is a room where allies talk before they act. That room is now empty. The founding logic of the alliance, written into its DNA at inception in 1949, was simple. Collective security requires collective deliberation, not unanimous agreement on every action that was never realistic. But the expectation, the bedrock assumption that held everything else together, was that before any member state took an action that could drag the entire alliance into war, they would consult, they would sit down, they would say, here is what we are about to do, here is why, here is what we need from you, here is what we expect in return. That conversation, even when it was difficult, even when it ended without consensus, was the glue. It was what made NATO more than a military arrangement. It made it a political community. On February 28th, that glue dissolved. The strikes were coordinated between the United States and Israel. They targeted Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. The scope and the speed of the operation made clear it had been planned for weeks, possibly months, and in all of that time, not a single NATO ally was briefed. Not the United Kingdom, America's closest partner. Not France, a nuclear power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Not Germany, the industrial anchor of European defense. Nobody. The alliance's Secretary General learned the same way a cab driver in Warsaw learned. He turned on the television. And then within 48 hours, the Trump administration did something that made the silence even more extraordinary. Having just launched a unilateral war in the Persian Gulf, Washington turned to the allies it had just shut out and demanded their help reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Let that land for a moment. You don't consult your partners before starting the fire, and then you call them to help you fight it. Former U.S. Ambassador to NATO Ivo Daalder has been careful in his public statements for years. He is not a man given to hyperbole. When Ivo Daalder goes on record and says, quote, something fundamental has broken, you should treat that the way you treat a structural engineer telling you the building is unsafe. This is not commentary. This is a diagnosis from someone who has spent his career inside the machinery. The European response was not coordinated, but it was coherent, and the speed with which it came together told its own story. Spain moved first and moved hardest. Madrid formally denied the United States access to the naval and air facilities at Rota and two of the most strategically significant American bases in Europe, positioned at the gateway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The Spanish government made no effort to soften the announcement. There was no diplomatic language about ongoing consultations or reviewing options. It was a no flat and public. That decision, confirmed by Al Jazeera and later by NPR reporting, sent a signal to every other NATO capital. The option of refusal is on the table. What comes next in this story will genuinely change how you understand the alliance's future, so stay with me, because we are only halfway through. The United Kingdom's response was more complicated and more revealing because of that complexity. Prime Minister Starmer initially refused to grant the United States access to British overseas bases for operations connected to the Iran campaign. That was the public posture, and it held briefly. Eventually, London walked back to a narrower position. Bases could be used for what Downing Street called defensive purposes only. The distinction between offensive and defensive in an active naval confrontation in the world's most important shipping choke point is, to put it generously, a legal fiction. But Starmer needed something to tell his own party, so that was the language they settled on. What matters more than the final position is what Starmer said publicly along the way. He said he was, and I want to use the exact word because it is significant, he said he was fed up. fed up with the economic consequences of, and he named them in sequence, the actions of Putin or Trump. He put the American president and the Russian president in the same sentence as equivalent sources of disruption, as co-equal problems. A British prime minister, standing in front of cameras, treating Washington and Moscow as functionally symmetrical threats to European stability. If you had told me 5 years ago that sentence would be spoken by the head of government in London, I would have told you that you were describing a world that didn't exist. Macron's France came out differently, but ended in the same place. Paris announced it would not participate in any Hormuz operation that, in Macron's words, does not seem clear. That is Gaullist diplomatic French for, we have no idea what you are doing or why, and we are not walking into it blind. France has always maintained an independent foreign policy, but the Fifth Republic has also always understood that the Atlantic relationship was worth preserving even when Paris disagreed with Washington. What Macron said was not just a refusal. It was a statement that the terms of the relationship itself were no longer clear enough to act on. Washington's response to all of this was, in some ways, the most telling development of all. The White House, through its communications apparatus, referred to the European governments raising objections as, and this is the phrase, so-called allies. Two words that contain an entire worldview, not allies who disagree, not partners. With concerns, so-called allies. The scare quotes were not accidental. They were a message. Your membership in this alliance is conditional on your compliance, and we are the ones who set the conditions. That is not how NATO works. That has never been how NATO works, and every European foreign minister who read that phrase understood exactly what it meant for the future. Here is where we are now, and I want to be precise about what is fact and what remains uncertain, because this story is still developing and the people who cover it badly will blur those lines. What is confirmed, the strikes on Iran were launched February 28, 2026, without NATO consultation. That is not disputed by anyone, including the administration. What is confirmed, Spain denied access to Rota and what is confirmed, the United Kingdom initially refused base access and eventually settled on a defensive use carve-out. What remains in the realm of analysis rather than established fact is whether the transatlantic relationship can be structurally repaired while this administration is in office or whether the damage is of the kind that outlasts any single presidency. My read, and I want to be clear, this is an analytical judgment, not a wire report, is that the trust deficit is now permanent in a way it wasn't before February 28th. Here is why. Before this moment, European governments could tell themselves that the turbulence was episodic, that the alliance's foundations were intact even when the surface was rough. They could point to existing mechanisms, to the Article 5 commitment, to the shared intelligence architecture, to the military interoperability built across decades, and argue that the institution was durable enough to survive the politics. That argument is now materially harder to make, because the argument always depended on one assumption, that even a difficult American president would, at minimum, make the call before starting a war. He didn't make the call. And the Europeans now have to build their strategic planning around the possibility that he never will. That is not a rhetorical shift. That is a practical one. It changes how you position forces. It changes what you share and what you hold back. It changes the value calculation on hosting American infrastructure on your soil when that infrastructure can become a liability in a war you didn't know was starting. Britain and France are now committing what official statements describe as limited resources to the effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. This is being framed carefully as a contribution to maritime security rather than participation in the Iran campaign. Whether that distinction holds legally or practically as the operation unfolds is something we will know more about in the coming weeks. But the fact that both governments are threading this needle rather than simply saying yes or simply saying no tells you everything about the political damage that has already been done. They are helping, but they are helping in a way specifically designed to signal that they are not committed. That is the worst of both outcomes for Washington. You get the support, but you don't get the credibility of genuine solidarity, and Europe signals to its own publics that it is acting under duress, not out of shared purpose. Now pull back. Look at the full picture. The Strait of Hormuz remains partially disrupted, with global energy markets absorbing volatility they had not priced in before February. Iran has not collapsed and has not capitulated, which means the strategic objective of the strikes, whatever it was, has not been achieved. NATO is operating without the consultation architecture. That made it function as a political institution rather than just a military one. Spain has publicly defied an American base access request for the first time in the modern alliance's history. A British Prime Minister has publicly equated Washington and Moscow as sources of instability. The White House has called its core European partners so-called allies, and the next major crisis, whatever form it takes, wherever it emerges, will arrive in an alliance where the trust account has been drawn down to zero. There is a pattern in history that I keep coming back to when I look at this moment. Alliances do not usually collapse because an enemy destroys them from outside. They collapse because the internal belief that holds them together quietly withdraws. It is not dramatic when it happens. It does not look like a declaration or a withdrawal. It looks like what we are seeing right now. Allies who show up but arrive late, who contribute but contribute minimally, who stand at the table but keep one foot pointed toward the door. The Warsaw Pact did not end when the Red Army lost a battle. It ended when the satellite states stopped believing Moscow would or could hold the thing. Together, the belief went first, everything else followed. I am not saying NATO is the Warsaw Pact. I am saying that the quiet withdrawal of genuine commitment before the formal structure changes is the same dynamic. And right now, in European capitals, serious people are having conversations about strategic autonomy and European defense frameworks and alternative security. Architectures that 2 years ago were academic exercises. They are no longer academic. They are contingency planning. The next time a major crisis breaks, the next time an American administration needs its European partners to respond within hours, to move assets, to open bases, to stand in a Security Council chamber and vote the same way, the phone will ring in Paris and London and Berlin and Madrid, and the person on the other end will pick up. They will probably say the right words, but something in the room will be different. Something will have shifted in the quality of the silence before they speak. And you will know, if you have been paying attention, that the call that didn't happen on February 28th is the reason. Will Europe rebuild a security architecture capable of acting independently before the next crisis arrives? Will Washington under this administration or the next understand what it has actually surrendered? And if the alliance that prevented a third European war for 3/4 of a century is now operating on procedural compliance rather than genuine trust, what exactly are we left with when the moment comes that requires more than compliance? I don't know the answers, nobody does yet, but the questions are no longer theoretical. If this kind of analysis matters to you, the kind that doesn't wait for the official narrative to settle, that follows the story where the evidence leads before the consensus catches up, subscribe, hit the notification bell, because what I have just walked you through is not the end of this story, it is the beginning of a much longer reckoning, and I will be here for every development as it comes.